I'm Rabbi Laura Geller, the Rabbi Emerita of Temple Emanuel of Beverly Hills. I serve on the board of directors of CoGenerate, a national nonprofit focused on bringing generations together to bridge divides and to co-create a better future. Welcome, and thank you for coming to this webinar on how cogenerational innovation can strengthen faith communities and society. I want to start by providing some background context for why this topic is so important right now. As you may know, we're living in the most age-segregated society in history. And yet there are 6 generations alive at the same time. Congregations and faith communities are one of the few third spaces outside of homes or workplaces that can attract both younger and older people. But as most of you know, it's not easy, and it's not always happening. I see in my congregation, and I bet many of you see in yours, that faith communities are focusing their attention on millennials and families with young children, and often ignoring older adults, many of whom are leaving as a result. So today, we're going to hear about new ways to bring generations together around faith community. I want to open with 2 quick stories about my own attempts to create an intergenerational life. The first is about companionship, the second about community. After my husband died, I discovered that I hated being alone. Well, actually, the revelation came to me as an epiphany the night I came home to an empty house to discover 2 huge raccoons in my bedroom. They came in through the cat door. After screaming and shooing them out with a broom, I made the decision to get a roommate. So I rented a room in my house to a younger person. First, it was a cello player who was here on a summer internship, and then there were a few other students. In each of these cases, my daughter warned me, "Mom, remember, you're looking for a friend, and they're looking for a cheap place to live." I learned from these experiences that I didn't want to just rent a room. What I really wanted was to share my home, to share the food, to occasionally eat meals together, to come home on a Friday night to a house full of younger people sitting around the Shabbat table, and for me to be invited to join them. For the past 2 years, my housemates were a couple, 2 rabbinical students. They were ordained in May, and now they're serving their own congregations. Now my housemate is a 3rd-year rabbinical student from New Zealand. Every 2 weeks, we meet to share what we're grateful for in our connection to each other and what we need to pay attention to in order to strengthen it. As we begin these meetings, we read a brit, the Hebrew word for covenant. And here's the brit that we wrote. This covenant is illuminated by the teachings of Jewish tradition in Proverbs 24. By wisdom, a house is built, and by understanding, it's established. By knowledge, the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. We understand a shared home to reflect shared values, interests, mutual respect, and open communication, and a place where each of us feels comfortable and at home. Makom means place, and it's also a name for the divine. We will strive to create a home that is also a sacred place. My housemates have become my friends, and I've discovered that one of the secrets of getting good at getting older is having younger friends. The second quick story, when I began to look for community, I found the village movement, where a neighborhood becomes a kind of homeowners association on steroids, with neighbors helping neighbors. Everyone stays in their own homes, but they help each other with household tasks, providing care, programs, and transportation. And they coordinate recreational, social, educational, and cultural programs planned and led by the members. When I discovered this model, I realized that a good synagogue could be a village. So, with the help of talented lay leaders, we created Chai Village LA, a unique partnership between two synagogues to create the first synagogue-based village in the country. Now it's 7 years old. There are 250 members. It's enabled older congregants aged 60 and above to stay in their homes by establishing a supportive community to help them. And we decided that in order to join the village, one would need to be a member of one of the two congregations. It turns out that people who were leaving the congregation decided to stay, and that new people decided to join the congregations in order to be part of the village. To say it was a win-win is an understatement. Chai Village has become an antidote to loneliness and a source of joy and adventure, but it is still a very age-segregated community. And here's the challenge. It seems to me that a faith-based village ought to be a blessing for younger folks as well as older ones. Our village includes members ranging from their early 60s to their early 90s. But we've not succeeded in bringing in folks in their 40s who are still building careers and raising families, let alone even younger generation. But what I'd really love to see, some of the older folks becoming surrogate grandparents for younger families, or mentors to younger folks at early stages in their careers. And I'd love to see younger families inviting a solo ager like me to share a holiday meal. What I long for is a multi-generational village where people of all ages harness our different talents, experiences, and passions to make a difference in the world. But that hasn't happened yet, which is why I'm particularly excited today to learn from younger and older faith leaders about cogenerational projects that they, and perhaps others of you in our audience, have launched in and around faith community. We'll hear what's working, we'll hear what's not, and we'll hear how to apply these learnings more broadly. With that as context, it's now my pleasure to introduce Eunice Lynn Nichols, co-CEO of CoGenerate, to introduce and to moderate our panel.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Geller, for your opening remarks and the context setting. One of the many things I love about our CoGenerate board members is the fact that each of them has skin in the game on cogeneration. They really live it out in their daily lives and in their deepest pursuits. So I really appreciate that. I'm eager to jump into conversation with our special guest today, but before I do that, I'd like to first introduce Danielle Goldstone, the founder of Interfaith. Interfaith is a nonprofit inspiring people of faith to address the social challenges of our time through innovation and collaboration. So Danielle's just going to wave briefly. She's going to come back at the end of our conversation to host a Q&A and offer some closing reflections. She'll be managing the Q&A box, so just a few housekeeping items. There's a Q&A feature in webinar. If you have questions as we're having this conversation, please put them there. That's the best way for us to see them and track them. We also are aware that many of you attending this webinar do intergenerational work in your faith communities. So if you have resources or tips that you'd like to share to add to the collective wisdom that's happening here, please put that in the chat box. You can have conversations with each other there. We'll share that wisdom that we've surfaced along with a recording of this webinar after the fact by email, so you'll get it all. Okay, with that, let's jump into our conversation. First up is Ian West, who goes by E. E is the co-founder and lead organizer of the Faith Land Initiative at the Church Council of Greater Seattle. They're a social innovator in our CoGen Challenge to advance economic opportunity. And he really works intergenerationally with local faith institutions in Seattle to repurpose religious spaces for the good of the community. I don't know if it's broadly known, but I've also learned that E is a pretty incredible singer. So that's my introduction to E. My first question is just to ask you to give us some context for why you founded the Faith Land Initiative and why an intergenerational lens is critical to the work that you do.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, Eunice. It's a pleasure to be on with everyone this afternoon. Yes, so a little bit of background on the Faith Land Initiative. So it's been in existence since 2019, and it really came out of listening to our community. And when I say our, the Church Council of Greater Seattle, of which the Faith Land Initiative is a program, has been around for over 100 years. And so we have many historic relationships with predominantly Christian faith communities, although operating in a multi-faith setting, so across different religions, predominantly in the King County and Seattle area. And so back in 2019, in a season where we had just come out of doing a lot of advocacy around several housing justice battles that were going on at City Hall and regionally, myself and a couple of my co-founders, Joey Ager and Michael Ramos, respectively, our former co-executive director, we were really doing our due diligence as organizers and trying to see where the energy was for our faith communities and our faith leaders to see if they could, if they were ready to get back on the horse, basically, and continue the good work we'd been doing in the advocacy space. And what we heard from those clergy folks and those lay folks across the region, that we were not looking for it, is that they still had the heart for the work, but in truth, their capacity was taken up by trying to figure out what to do with the buildings they were in and with congregations that were starting to lose members, which of course affected finances and so on and so forth. And these were predominantly white faith communities. At the same time, we were having conversations in communities of color and with congregations of color, especially African-American congregations in the historic Central District, which is the historic African-American neighborhood in Seattle. And hearing from them that there was a lot of vision, there was a lot of plans even, but there was not a lot of political will or access to the assets necessary to bring those visions and plans together at that time. And so they were asking for help, and the lay leaders and clergy folks we had spoken to before were asking for help. And here was a church council kind of in the middle, being asked to be a bridge. And that was really where the seed of thought, if you will, for the Faith Land Initiative came together. And so, like I said, that was 2019. Now we're in 2024. We've had a series of cohorts. We also support faith communities on an individual basis. There's a network, there's technical resources, there's a relational brain trust. All of that might come out in the questions as we go on. But to answer the next question that Eunice posed around intergenerational lenses, really to fully tap into the abundance that's present in our faith communities, we'd be remiss if we didn't approach things with an intergenerational lens. As the rabbi so eloquently put, faith communities are one of the last spaces in our society that's increasingly age segregated, that organically and intentionally are intergenerational spaces where cogenerational work is possible. And additionally, through the work with CoGenerate as part of the cohort, I've also personally been able to see the pattern in the faith communities that have been more successful in their discernment processes and more effective. And that's really when they have cogenerational collaboration. And so with the Faith Land Initiative, we accompany, facilitate, and convene faith communities in King County, Washington, to faithfully and equitably steward land and other assets towards acts of dignity restoration and community stewardship of land. So we're really in that discernment, visioning space before they take transformative action. And cogenerational collaboration is a necessity for that.
I love that vision, E, and I'm guessing there are some folks in our audience that would love to hear a story or something concrete about an action you've seen churches take that have helped them to heal and transform generational and other divides in the communities and really share those assets that they have with one another.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to share one. So yeah, one of our great successes happened in 2022. So we were supporting a Mennonite congregation in the northern part of the city of Seattle. They owned a home in Capitol Hill, which is known as the historic gayborhood of Seattle. So historic, gay neighborhood, LGBTQ neighborhood in Seattle. They had owned this home since 1970, when at that time they got a loan through their sort of denominational bank. And it was only a $30,000 house. This house is 8 bedrooms, has several bathrooms, is sitting on a nice front and backyard in what is considered now prime real estate in the city of Seattle. And it's right on the edge of the Central District, the neighborhood I mentioned briefly before, which is the historic Black neighborhood or African-American neighborhood in Seattle. So all of these neighborhoods have experienced a wild amount of gentrification in the last decade or so, way more than other parts of the city, though it, of course, has spread. And so really the year was around 2017, I actually lived in this house. So I do want to name that. I had a personal connection to this house, lived there for 2 years. And the role that it served in the community was as a volunteer service house for the Mennonite Voluntary Service, a national program. That program shut down. And so the Seattle Mennonite Church that was discerning the use of the future of this house wanted to give the house, they decided after some of their own discernment, around 4 years of that, to give the house as an act of small r reparations, a reparative act, to a BIPOC community group in the city, somewhere in the region. However, as a predominantly and historically white faith community that was not even geographically located in the place where this house was, they said themselves they didn't feel like they could be fully accountable in making the decision just in their own bubble. And so they reached out to the Church Council, to the Faith Land Initiative for support to help them basically get over the hump and take this transformative action. And so myself and a colleague, Melly Morales, at that time, we accompanied them for about 7 months biweekly with coaching, helping them with learning meetings with land trusts, tribes, and other collectives, BIPOC collectives across the region to really figure out, what were their mission, vision, and values? How did that align in this moment of discernment and taking action? And how could they have good conversations so they weren't inadvertently pitting groups against each other, even as they were trying to do something good? And something I want to note for this context is this group of leaders that we were primarily working with was a very cogenerational group. It was about 3 generations represented across this group, which was coming out of a congregation that was also very age diverse. And so one of the things that they shared with us, once they got to the point of actually making the decision, which they did make, and so they transferred that deed to the Trans Women of Color Solidarity Network, which is now working on the house and stewarding it in the future to be low or no income housing for Black trans women and femmes in need of housing, whether it's long-term or transitional, in this iconic intersection of neighborhoods, as well as a mutual aid hub. But when they were just about to take that vote, something that the leaders shared with us, which I thought was really brave of them, was that actually it was sort of in this cogenerational conversation that the decision was made. And when I say that, I mean that the younger generations were encouraging the older generations amongst the congregation, because they work in a consensus model, so they had to come to consensus, to live into their mission, vision, and values. And they're like, you all have taught us these things. You all have exemplified them in so many ways. The Mennonites have a long history of peace and justice. And this is a true act where we can directly do something great and bridge a divide, right? In a lot of different ways across communities, but we have to take that leap. We have to go out on a limb. And so it was really that moment of challenge, and then the older generations rising up to that challenge and them all voting together in a consensus that led to the deed being transferred at the end of the year, December of 2022. So that's a little bit in a nutshell, but yeah, happy to share that story.
What a great story. I love that it highlights the need for a truly collaborative approach, and in some ways churches needing to work with other churches who have different strengths and assets and relationships across generations, making sure there are no blind spots in order to make something like that happen. I'm going to ask you one last quick question, which is, during a time when many religious institutions are seeing fewer and fewer young people enter their doors, what's one tip you would offer religious leaders who want to help their aging institutions remain relevant to younger generations?
Sure. Listen to your neighbors. I would say the main thing, what we've seen be successful, is when a strong group of leaders who have good personalities, who are charismatic, who are excited about this work, can go into the surrounding neighborhood, with truly open hearts and minds and get to know the people around them, share a little bit about what the church is doing, and invite folks in truly just to get to know them as people.
Awesome. Thank you, E. I'll have you go off camera. I'm going to introduce our next two. A reminder, if you have questions for E or for any of our panelists, put it in the Q&A box. You can also put it in the chat, but we'll track it more easily if you put it in the Q&A, and we'll have time to get to some of those questions at the end. All right, so now I'm going to introduce to you two wonderful social innovators that I've been tracking actually for quite a while. So Wendy Goldberg is the executive director of the Tri-Faith Initiative, a really cool collaboration between an interfaith center, a synagogue, a church, and a mosque in Omaha, Nebraska, of all places. She's a thought leader on the shifting religious landscape in America and has a deep commitment to bridging differences and cultivating inclusive environments. Wendy is also a fourth-generation Omahan. Jeremy Fricke is Tri-Faith's Vice President of Mission Advancement and has expertise in marginalized and new religious communities, racism and religion, and interfaith understandings of the Abrahamic scriptures, amongst many other topics. I actually had the immense privilege of meeting two of the founding members of the Tri-Faith Initiative about 10 years ago when it was just an idea. And I feel like the last few months have brought to the forefront just how much our country and the world needs communities like this one that you two are a part of to serve as a beacon for what's possible in the midst of a lot of pain, loss, and complexity. I'm particularly interested in hearing what you've learned about bridging generational divides and fostering intergenerational connection and healing during these challenging times. So Wendy, I'm going to start with you and just ask what makes the Tri-Faith Initiative work, and what are some of the programs the individual faith institutions or your interfaith center offer that you found to be most effective at bridging generational and other divides?
Thank you. I think at the beginning and the end of every story that we tell about the Tri-Faith Initiative, it starts with people showing up. Our founding story is about some members of the Jewish community showing up at a mosque in solidarity, not necessarily having answers, but to appreciate that everyone deserves to be treated fairly and justly as part of our community. And it ends or even begins and deepens with autonomy, the ability for each person to have a voice and for us to reject a monolithic mindset. And that really spurs the opportunity for different people to engage with the work that they do with us differently. And that is part of how we have engaged different generations in our work, by giving people the autonomy to decide what is the lens through which they're going to participate with us. And because we have these deep partnerships within faith community right here on the Tri-Faith Commons, a number of projects have birthed. One is a community garden and orchard, and it was initiated by the synagogue and as a social justice project that they didn't have the capacity to do themselves, and imagined what would happen if they were able. We had some retired master gardeners who really wanted to add and address food insecurity, to become in relationship with the neighbors on the Tri-Faith Commons. And fast forward the 5 years that they have been planning and then executing this project, this last year, they were able to grow over 8,000 pounds and over 2,500 pounds in hours in volunteer service. And those volunteers and the recipients of literally what they have produced are again examples of intergenerational strategic partnerships, whether those things go to address food insecurity at food banks, or we have a partnership with an intergenerational home that does daycare for refugee families that are able to come during the day when their families are perhaps having two-income households, and the seniors who are living with them need a place to be during the day. And some funny story that happened there, we had on one of our early meetings there, the gardeners from the Tri-Faith Initiative were helping them to establish or clean up the garden that they had started, and started weeding some things that we ended up learning were culturally significant to the menu and recipe planning for the folks who were building that garden at that other location. There's also opportunities in this moment for us to understand racial justice from multiple perspectives. So not only from different religious perspectives, but we know that people from different generations have a different relationship to intersectional identity, and race is a factor within that. And so each of the congregations have worked hard to look in the mirror at issues of racial justice, but this has been an opportunity for small cohorts of people to come together, not only to learn or to do study groups, but to commingle between ages and inspire advocacy and such together. A third initiative that has happened, and so the garden initiative grew out of the first out of the synagogue. Many of the racial justice projects grew first out of the church. And so not only are we inviting people across lines of age, but we're inviting people across lines of religion to do these kind of social justice projects within and between communities. And one that's probably closest to my heart grew out of the mosque, and they had a number of folks who were newer immigrants to the United States and had children who had complex health issues. And they were really struggling to be able to meet the needs of the kids and to have the resources within the community to do that. And so they created a mentoring cohort of the families, and often providing care and respite care for the kids during their meetings, so that they could come together and start to build these mentoring relationships between folks who were retired but had adult children who have they've had a lifetime of experience with, and bridge that relationship building with people who had just given birth to kids who have also maybe different complex health situations. And it ended up to be, it still is, just a beautiful example of being able to share the heart of the therapeutic and pastoral care of showing up for each other, but also the folks like me who have lived in the community a long time and have connections with people to understand where resources are available. That was really a beautiful bridge. And the thing I don't want to leave out is the opportunities and things that we often do for education and gathering around food at the Tri-Faith Commons, because food is really something that bridges divide and helps us to tell our stories, to share the tastes and flavor of our stories, and to help people feel heard, and even sometimes just to feel safe, that they have a place that they are safe to tell their stories. So those are some of my my favorite examples.
Thank you, Wendy. Jeremy, I'm eager to bring your voice into this as well because of your unique vantage point. What have you learned about bridging generational divides and fostering these intergenerational connections, both within the congregations that you work with in Tri-Faith, but also across faiths? And I know that you've had some interesting insights into the bridging of intergenerational and faith conversations in the workplace, which is not always something that faith institutions think about in terms of their relevance in the world.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of different directions to go with this. But the first really is that in our experience, in my experience, being deeply inclusive about the range of identities, period, is also going to help with the inclusivity across generations. So, at Tri-Faith Initiative, we define religion by kind of not defining it. We basically say it's however anyone relates to religion. So when we're having interfaith dialogue, it doesn't matter who you are, however you relate to religion, that is invited. Secular, atheist, any religion, maybe you don't care at all. That's still part of the conversation. Part of that is because younger folks have a different relationship to religion in general. And many of the church and synagogue institutions in particular have an average age that's much higher. So in some sense, we have to decide how important crossing generational divides is, and really make sure that we have open arms with what that all might include. What are we including beyond just having folks who are a different age than us, those life experiences translate to many more things that may not already be represented in our religious communities. So a couple ways, one way that we define religion in a sense is also the 5 Bs, which are belief, behavior, belonging, becoming, and body. I'm not sure how to post it in the chat there, but so basically belief, behavior, belonging, these have been around a while, belief being these internal thoughts and emotions, behavior being the kind of practices and ways that we practice ethics, and belonging being our communities that we're involved with. But people interact with religion in a lot more ways as well. And in my experience, it has been really advantageous to talk about both becoming and body in reference to generational divides. So becoming is how people change over time. Really being able to dive into the story of how we relate to religion differently than we did in the past, or maybe differently in the future than we do now. And that really allows different generations to connect on their life experiences. And then body, which includes, race, sexual, sex, and any other identity that people associate with their bodies. And age and other factors really do become something that influence how people relate to religion. And this has really given a language for people to be able to have more effective conversations, both across religious difference and across generational difference.
It's so helpful. I love the framing of becoming in particular, because there's a focus on the fact that we are not all the same. And I think as we grow in our lives and our spiritual lives, that our viewpoints change. And I think that can be an area that brings some humility into the conversation for both older and younger folks. So thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to hold off on, I had one more question for you, but we might come back to it in the Q&A, just so I can make sure we have time for our third group here. So thank you, Wendy and Jeremy. I'm going to now introduce us to our final pair, Serena Bian and Tutu. Serena is another CoGenerate board member, and she's also the special advisor of design and innovation to the U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. She brings a spiritual inquiry to the public health crisis of loneliness and disconnection. And on top of that, she's a chaplain in training. Tutu is someone I've only recently had the pleasure of meeting through Serena. And I went to this retreat that Serena hosted, and I got the sense after meeting him, I've only touched the tip of the iceberg on his storied life, which includes serving as a personal bodyguard for Chiang Kai-shek, working as a photojournalist and documentary filmmaker, becoming a Zazen mystic, and making art as a form of meditation. So Serena and Tutu have been exploring a new expression of cogenerational partnership in emergent communities, and have recently entered into a very intriguing formal spiritual accompaniment or co-mentorship with each other. So Serena, I want to start with you and ask you, what is a multi-generational accompaniment? That's a term you threw out at me that I had never heard before. What is that, and how did it lead you to Tutu? And what do you guys actually do together?
Thank you, Eunice, and nice to be with you all, and you as well, Tutu. That's a great question, and I think is an emerging thing. I feel like multi-generational spiritual accompaniment is soul friends walking the path of life together, finding mutual delight and learning and grounding together. Obviously, we live in such complicated and complex times where it's so easy, I think especially for younger generations like myself, to fall into despair or to act from an ungrounded place. And so being held in friendship and relationship with elders like Tutu has been such an important tether for me. And Tutu and I met through his partner, Angela, who I am involved with in an organization with. And I believe I had shared with her a piece of writing about my own spiritual and cultural heritage about. And I think when Tutu read it, there must have been something in it that resonated with him. And I think due to our shared Chinese heritage, when we met in person several months ago, we kind of instantly had this moment where Tutu was like, you remind me of the granddaughter I never had. And, you know, I said something in return of similar seeing and feeling. And I think within Tutu, I can sense such a devoted practitioner and monastic, and one who is cultivating his heart. And that's been something that I, in my own work in social change, have often felt like there needs to be a deeper grounding, and have been in different meditation, kind of exploring Zen, Taoism, Buddhism, and seeking a teacher to practice with. And so I feel so grateful that in Tutu and in our kind of self-defined and formed relationship of training, which is what we call it, it's held by so much friendship and curiosity in one another.
I love this idea of a soul friend. Tutu, I want to bring you into this conversation because Serena has talked about training and the learning that she does from you, but I've heard you talk about it in the exact same way about what you are learning from Serena. I want to know why it's so important to you at this stage of your life to be in a collaborative, co-creative spiritual journey with somebody who is, I think Serena is like 40 years younger than you. So why is that so important to you, and how does it align with your spiritual practice as a Buddhist or as an artist, or all the ways that you move through life?
And you're on mute, Tutu.
All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Great.
Well, I've been waiting for somebody like Serena for a long time, and when it happened, it's magical, right? So that means that our spiritual paths have collide together, and there's a trust under the chemistry, and there's a huge, big love, sort of, bring us together. Actually, our purpose together is to cultivate our mind, our heart, and the body. So I'm elder, have a lot of experience, I have a lot of challenge in life. I have fall many times and stand up, so I have a lot of those experience. In my career, I was TV newsman and photojournalist and artist, and I think I realized that I was really, really strived to find truth, because my family tragedy, like my grandmother committed suicide, my father died for a young age, and I almost drowned at the age of 6 years old. After I learning how to swim for my dad, I thought I can go to the river and just try my swimming. But it was a big river. I only 6 years old. So all those experience of death have helped me to using my gift as art to find the truth. What is the truth, So I know that ultimately the truth with all the faith community, we all have a look for the truth. Because in the faith community, you have God, and in my Confucius and the Taoist and the tradition, Confucius say, well, before you know yourself, you don't want to talk about God, So for me, I don't against people have faith, but actually the faith for me is to find out what is not the faith, So that's what I'm looking for, to say, well, is that really a faith? What is the faith? I don't want to blindly pursue. So I
And these
thinking
are
that
some of the conversations that Tutu and I explore together in our practice.
Yeah, I have discovered that Tutu is a great question asker of the things that we say, but don't think deeply about what it means when we say it. And I can picture that exchange. I'm going to ask one last quick question. Either of you can answer this, and then we're going to segue into a Q&A with everyone. So once again, if you have questions, put it in the Q&A box. Saying this to our audience. And Serena and Tutu, you can just stay on as we shift into the Q&A in a second. What can individuals or faith institutions do to make this sort of soul friend connection you two made more accessible? I think there are probably many people who are like, I would love a soul friend, but I have no idea how I might find it. Are there ways so it doesn't feel like, I don't know, serendipity happened? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I can jump in briefly. I think finding for young people, finding elders that really just resonate with oneself. I think it has been something that I've just been in my own practice with. But then once you find them, having the kind of courageous or vulnerable conversation about wanting to explore deepening in connection. And I think Tutu and I kind of danced around different words of, is this mentorship? Is this teaching? Oh, it's training, and really trying to find the flavor of word that works best. And the other thing I'll say is that after Tutu and I both expressed a deeper desire to be in shared practice and training together, I think it actually took us a number of weeks before we set up specific training times and kind of a cadence. And I felt a little nervous to follow up because I didn't want to overwhelm Tutu, and finally kind of did that and realized, wow, I should have, or I could have done that longer ago. And so I think both within faith institutions as well as outside, I think just making the implicit explicit, and just asking, what of this do we want to do together?
Yeah, I love that.
Well, ultimately really is to cultivate really sensitivity. How can be kind, and also the most important is create synergy. And I think two people should create synergy, and then another third person, you can have a tri-scale synergy, then you have a quad synergy, right? So really purpose is to how can one of a group can create that kind of synergy out of love, compassion, So that's what really connect us together, because we can go out and play tennis and really happy when we walk out. We both won, right? So there's no losing side. So always win-win situation. That's my approach. So
yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for that. I am so grateful for the two of you and our other three special guests. I'm actually going to invite all of you to come on visually now, along with Rabbi Geller. And I'm going to also have Danielle come and facilitate some questions that she's been tracking in the chat box and in the Q&A as we close out the time together. And we're a small group, so just like wave your hand if you have a thought or want to answer one of these questions. All right, go for it, Danielle. Danielle, I think you might be on mute, or at least I can't hear you. Or somebody needs to unmute all of us. Hang on one second. I think we're all set, Danielle. No? Okay, can people hear me?
Yeah.
All right. While Danielle is figuring out her audio, I'm going to jump in with some questions, and you'll have to forgive me because I haven't been tracking the Q&A as closely. This is always the best of all worlds. We're just going to be organic. So let's see. I'm going to just start at the top. This was a question for E. Encouraging initiative. Have you ever confronted a conflict of interest from the community in terms of what somebody wanted for a facility and wanted it converted into something else, like an income generating venture, and it didn't match with the values? And how do you manage some of those things?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for that question. We have had some instances where people were interested in converting or transforming the space into something that generated income. However, normally it's been more so in the mindset of trying to sustain the faith community long term. So it might be kind of a both and situation where, for example, affordable housing could be built above the ground floor, but then there's a 99-year ground lease, not to get too deep into the real estate side of it, but a 99-year ground lease that would provide income generation where the faith community itself could still be on site, still have space after the redevelopment. So I wouldn't say it's ever been a conflict of interest because usually there's a little bit of both that we can do. And I will say, I think some of that's the framing of how we introduce the Faithland Initiative. We let people know up front that if they're looking for something fast to just sell it to the highest bidder, they can do that at any point of the day in Seattle, Washington, in King County, but that's not what they're doing when they're working with us.
More values driven. Thank you. Danielle, are you back?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yay.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you all so much. I really wish we had a lot more time for this conversation. I want to bring up a question I think that Daniel put in the chat, actually, which is how can you cultivate shared purpose across intergenerational communities? Have you found ways that are particularly helpful to do that? Serena?
Briefly and say one way that I think Tutu and I think perhaps, I mean, I think about it, Tutu can let me know, but cultivating with the head, the heart, and the hands. And I think with our practice, it's very about the heart and like in meditation, in Tai Chi, in the types of thoughts we have. But there's also the head component of how we think and finally how we act. And I think that's so a part of cogeneration is building together. And so one thing that has very naturally emerged from our training together has been this wondering of, what other young people are out there that might like to participate with us in this type of training, and thinking about summer camps in different iterations. So for us, I think there's an element of both the head, the heart, as well as the hands.
Well, that's well said. But I think for me, really to be, I think that there's a tremendous hungry for find truth to your body and your heart, but also your mind. Your mind is important too, because we're living in the world, everybody trying to accumulate so much knowledge from everyone, reading their book, internet, Facebook. So you have so many those things. So what I want to share with Serena is, can you have the critical tool to look at the truth in a different way? Not so much just, oh yeah, that's it, that whatever you see. That's why I always have a tremendous doubt about faith. What is a faith? You just blindly believe that there's a God there or not? You know what I mean? But I know that Jesus, Buddha, I think that the teaching are the same, right? And then you have the institution build its face. And I see a lot of, I've been to many in and out institutions. I see a lot of problem with the institution when the institution has ego and the power to control. It's not there to learn spirituality, but it's about controlling, right? So that's something is very dangerous. Anyway, that's my thought. So that's what I want to let only training the body, martial art, whatever it is, but also can you have the tool to look at the world with all this misinformation and you can find relative truth. And that's the thing that I want to share with her, you know. So I sent book to her for her to read. If she can absorb this book, digest it, to have that kind of critical lens to look at the world, not just whatever people say, what New York Times say, or Wall Street say, or whatever that, you know.
I
right?
just am looking at the time and I want to make sure that our other co-panelists get it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wise words. Wendy, I saw your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
I think too often we speak in a monolithic mindset and we talk about, oh, the millennials these days or Gen Z or the boomers. And I'm always looking to reject that, you know, when we know that generations have different relationships to different questions, but it's important that we invite intersectional identity and the opportunity for people to share their own narrative. You know, I would use Jeremy as an example. You know, he falls in the category of millennial, but he's one of the oldest souls I've ever met. So, you know, let's be careful with those kinds of broad generalizations, and really invite people to be their authentic selves.
Thank you. And on that note, I want to there's a question in here that is, how do you bridge generations who present significant political or cultural disagreements, and how do you even start the process of listening to each other? And I just want to sort of add on to that, you know, how do we get past sort of social hierarchies and really create spaces where all voices are equally valued, young people and older generations, and how do we make sure we're listening to each other across the differences that we have?
I would like to comment on that. It seems to me that one of the challenges in these kinds of co-generational conversations is actually learning to listen and not believing that particularly when you're dealing with older folk, that wisdom resides in me and I'm passing it down, but rather that it is mutual wisdom and that it goes both ways. And I think particularly, and here I'm stereotyping, many older people really need to learn how to listen. First, just to listen and not to give advice and not to fix and not to say this is what it was like when I was young. And I think that we need to actually teach people, younger and older, what it means to really listen and just be present.
Thank you, Rabbi Geller. Jeremy?
Yeah, so one thing we've experienced on the Tri-Faith Commons in general, and this is a little more interfaith first, but let's unpack it to be about generations as well. In my experience, almost every religious institution puts a sign out on their door that says, all are welcome here, or you know, please come be a guest, right? And that is important, don't get me wrong, but it seems to me that we need to get to a place where we're able to be effective guests for others as well, really being able to show up in the spaces that that have the folks that we want to be in relationship with, right? So when we're talking about the generational divides as well, part of this has to do with making sure that there are opportunities to be in each other's sort of spaces, right? I don't know that, in my opinion, every conversation has to be equal in each individual conversation, but when we look at the whole tapestry of relationship, that's where it should look the most equal, right? Not each individual iteration, but the whole tapestry of the relationship.
Thanks, Jeremy. And E, we'll give you the last word on that question, and then we're going to close out.
Oh, wow. No pressure. Okay. What I was just going to offer, because I know part of the question was like, where do you start? And I've found that utilizing a circle process, so being in circle, having a talking piece, having an altar, some sort of centering space in the middle, that can be a great place that if you are trying to have a feeling of equality among people in the conversation, even if it seems like folks are on different sides of that conversation, at least there is like a container that can be created through that process, where everyone gets to speak, and the agreement is that everyone hears what the other person is trying to say, and can ground themselves in the best intent and the values of the space. So there's a lot more that could be said about that, but I just wanted to offer that as like a concrete process.
Thanks, E. And yeah, so I think that's all the time we have for Q&A, and we apologize if we didn't get to your questions, but feel free to reach out. We'll share contact info with the recording and other things after. And I just wanted to share a few reflections on this amazing conversation today, and thank you again to Eunice and to all of our panelists. At Interfaith, we approached CoGenerate about doing this webinar because, one, we're just huge fans of the work that CoGenerate does. And two, we can't really imagine a more relevant topic and opportunity for faith communities today. You know, as a couple panelists mentioned, right, for so many of us, besides our family, our faith communities have been the only place where we regularly interact and build relationships with folks from infants through to seniors in our community. And of course, faith communities have traditionally been places, you know, where we celebrate and recognize all of life's rites of passage from birth through to death. And that's a hugely significant role that faith communities play that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation about the decline of mainstream religion in the US and what that means. But this recognition of the sacredness of you know, different stages of life is such a kind of well of wisdom, I think, that is really needed in the world. And at both Interfaith and CoGenerate, our work is about fostering collaboration for social impact. But I think one of the lessons for me out of this conversation is that we can't even really get to that conversation without, one, this first recognition piece of the significance and sacredness of life at every stage, and then the soul friendships that Serena and Tutu talked about, right? That those relationships that we build with each other is the foundation, I think, for our social impact work together. And I just also want to say, because I think we had folks fill in what generation you are when you register for this. So I think this audience trends to older generations. And so I just also want to share that at this intersection of faith and innovation where we work, I've seen a lot of innovation efforts geared at how do we get young people involved? How do we solve the problem of young people not showing up? And I think it's a completely valid question and a very good design question for innovation. But I also think it's the wrong one. And I heard a little bit of that in the conversation today, right? Like that the better question maybe is a more general one. I think, Jeremy, you talked about this, right? Like, how are we showing up for our communities, not as in those people that walk in the doors of our congregation or our community, but right, the community in which we sit. And, you know, how are we bringing our wisdom and our assets to meet the spiritual and relational and social change needs of that community? And young people, of course, are just people with the same needs as all of us and also have those spiritual and relational needs. And they're particularly interested in social change. So if we're focusing on those things rather than how many people are showing up at our doors, then I think we're going to be in conversation with young people, because even if they're not showing up, they're here in all of our communities. And as somebody said, we need to show up, right, for them. And we need to, I think, invest in their leadership. So this question about how do you create equality of voice across the generations? So often I think we go and we ask, you know, what should, you know, ask young people, what do we do to involve more folks like you? And what if we asked and said, hey, would you like to co-lead this initiative that we're doing? Or would you like to advise on our, you know, religious education curriculum, or we're thinking about ways to address gun violence in our community, and can you be part of that conversation, right? And investing in those voices and leadership, not just to get people to come church or synagogue or mosque or temple, but really to invest in leadership. So on behalf of Interfaith and our partner CoGenerate, thank you all so much for joining us today. We're really excited to see the energy around this topic. Our two organizations will continue to engage on it to see what else we can do to advance not only the conversation, but also innovation in this space. So if you're interested in going deeper, do reach out to us. We will share out the recording of this webinar, as I mentioned, as well as some resources. And I don't know if it has popped up, but before you go, there will be a poll asking just a few feedback questions. So please complete that before you go. Thank you again to our panelists. It's been really an honor to spend this time with you. And thank you to everyone for joining us, and go forth to the rest of your day, we hope, with new ideas and inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Serena, to Jeremy, Wendy, Rabbi Geller, and E. You are all amazing. Bye, everyone.